They thought the night would pass like any other, but by 2 a.m., every man in Red Hollow was wide awake, staring at the same thing. Footprints, not leading out of town, but circling back in. Clara Whitlock was gone, yet her tracks appeared on every porch, every doorstep, stopping just inches from their doors before turning away.
Clara.
No one heard her. No one saw
Tell them
her.
the truth,
But
Clara.
everyone knew she'd been there. Elias Crow checked his own porch last. His hand tightened when he saw something the others didn't. A second set of tracks, larger, deeper, following hers, and heading straight toward the town. Full story on my channel. Title: She left the town. But her footsteps came back that night, fearful face. They drove her out like she meant nothing. But by dawn, the truth started clawing its way back. One by one, the townsfolk found the same thing nailed to their doors. A piece of paper, their names written in Clara Whitlock's hand. And underneath, dates. Dates of things they'd done, things they'd buried, things no one else should have known. Elias Crow held his longer than the rest, his jaw tight as he read the final line. I kept your secrets. Now they keep you awake. The wind carried something cold through Red Hollow that morning. Not revenge, not fear, something worse. Truth. And it wasn't done yet. Full story on my channel. They told her to leave the town before sundown, and by midnight, not a single soul could close their eyes. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or state below. And if you believe justice doesn't always come with a gun, hit like and follow. Now back to the story. Red Hollow sat under a sky stretched wide and empty, the kind of sky that made a man feel small and his secrets feel bigger. Dust moved slow across the main street, curling around boots, slipping through cracks in old wood like it had all the time in the world. Folks in Red Hollow didn't ask questions. They watched. They whispered. And when the whisper got loud enough, it became truth. Clara Whitlock stood alone in the center of it, her worn suitcase hanging at her side, the leather cracked from years that had taken more than they gave. No husband, no family, no one to speak when her name turned sour in other people's mouths. She had arrived 3 months ago with nothing but quiet steps and steady eyes, renting a small room above the general store, keeping to herself, paying in cash, never late. That alone was enough to make people uneasy. A woman with no past was a problem in a place built on stories. You need to leave, someone said. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words landed heavy anyway. Others gathered, not close, but close enough. Faces half hidden under hat brims, eyes sharp, waiting for something. An excuse, maybe. Clara didn't flinch. She looked at them the way a person looks at weather rolling in, knowing it can't be reasoned with. Before dark, another voice added. A man near the saloon door. Or we'll make it harder. No one stepped forward. No one touched her. That wasn't how Red Hollow worked. The town didn't need hands to push someone out. Just silence and enough eyes. At the edge of it all stood Elias Crow, leaning against a hitching post, arms loose at his sides, hat casting a shadow across his face. He hadn't spoken since he arrived in town that morning, hadn't ordered a drink, hadn't asked a question. Just watched. His kind of watching wasn't curiosity. It was weighing. Clara's gaze found him for a moment. Not long. Just enough to ask something without words. Elias didn't answer. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he chose not to. The wind shifted then, carrying the dry scent of sage and something colder underneath. Clara nodded once, almost to herself, then turned. No argument. No plea. Just the quiet sound of boots on packed dirt as she walked past them, past the saloon, past the blacksmith, past every pair of eyes that had already decided who she was. The sun was still high when she reached the edge of town, but it felt later somehow, like the day had already made up its mind. No one followed her. Not then. Doors closed a little earlier that evening. Lamps were lit before the sky fully dimmed. Men who usually laughed loud over cards kept their voices low. And somewhere beyond the last fence line, where the land opened wide and empty, a single light appeared where no house stood. Elias Crow saw it. First, he was still outside when the others had gone in, his eyes fixed on that distant glow that shouldn't have been there. It didn't flicker like a campfire. It held steady, like it was waiting. He pushed off the post, dust falling from his coat, and started walking toward it without a word. Behind him, Red Hollow settled into the kind of silence that doesn't bring rest. Because out here, when the wrong person is pushed too far, the night doesn't get louder. It just gets heavier. And that night, it did not let anyone sleep. The light did not move, and that was what unsettled him most. Out here, fire always breathed, always flickered with the wind, but this one held steady like it had decided to stay exactly where it was. Elias Crow walked past the last fence post of Red Hollow, boots pressing into the dry earth that still held the heat of the day, though the air had already begun to cool. The town behind him had gone quiet in the way a place does when everyone is pretending nothing is wrong. He did not look back. He had lived long enough to know that silence like that was never empty. It was full of things people did not want to face. The distance stretched 100 yards, then 2, the glow growing clearer but no louder, no crackle, no sound of wood breaking or flame feeding. Just light. He slowed as he approached, not out of fear, but out of respect for something he did not yet understand. Clara Whitlock stood beside it, her silhouette calm against the dim horizon, the same worn suitcase resting at her feet. She had not built a fire. There was no wood stacked, no ash, no sign of anything that should be burning. Yet the lantern beside her cast a wide circle across the ground, too wide for its size, too still for the wind that now tugged at Elias's coat. She did not turn when he stopped 10 feet away. She knew he was there. "You followed," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying without effort in the open land. Elias tipped his hat back slightly, eyes narrowing at the ground around her. No tracks leading in, only her own, ending right where she stood. "I saw the light," he answered. It was the truth, but not all of it. Clara nodded once, as if that explained everything. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying the faint scent of dust and something older, something like paper left too long in a closed room. Quickly, someone had seen something, or felt it. Elias kept walking, knowing before he reached the main street that sleep would not come easy to anyone that night, and that whatever Clara Whitlock carried in that quiet suitcase, it was already moving through the town without ever needing to step inside. The first knock came just after midnight, soft enough to be mistaken for wind, but no one in Red Hollow believed in wind that knocked twice. Elias Crow heard it from across the street, standing in the shadow of the general store, his eyes moving slowly from one dark window to the next as if the town itself had started breathing differently. A door opened a fraction, then shut again. Another followed, then another, each one careful, each one afraid to make a sound that might carry too far. No one stepped outside, but everyone was awake. Dalton did not look up. "No," he said, but his voice carried something uncertain. Elias stepped inside, closing the door behind him with care. "Then why are you still here?" Dalton's hand tightened on the paper. "Because if I go home," he said slowly, "I will have to look at my own door." The words settled heavy between them. Elias glanced down. The paper was blank, or at least it should have been. But as he watched, faint lines began to form, like ink finding its way through old fibers. Dalton leaned back in his chair, as if distance might stop it. It did not. Outside, another knock echoed, this time farther down the street. Then another, spreading, one house to the next, never loud, never rushed, just steady, patient. Elias stepped back out into the night, his jaw set, his eyes drawn to every door that now held something unseen on the other side. He did not need to check them all. He already understood. This was not something you could chase down or stop. It was something you had to face. And one by one, behind closed doors, the people of Red Hollow were beginning to realize the same thing. Clara Whitlock had not come back. She did not need to. Whatever she carried in that quiet suitcase had already arrived, and it knew exactly where to knock. The knocking stopped all at once, and that silence felt louder than anything that came before it. Elias Crow stood in the middle of Red Hollow's main street, the dust unmoving around his boots, the night air heavy like it had settled into the bones of every building. No more sounds, no more warnings, just a stillness that forced a man to listen to himself whether he wanted to or not. One by one, doors began to open, not wide, just enough for a face to appear, pale in lamplight, eyes searching for something that could not be seen anymore. Carter Wells stepped out first, his hat forgotten inside, his hands hanging useless at his sides. He looked down at his porch, then back at the empty street, his mouth opening like he had something to say, but no words willing to come. Across from him, Mrs. Halford did the same, her door creaking as she leaned out, her gaze fixed on the ground where nothing remained, yet everything had already been left behind. No footprints now, no paper, no sign that anything had ever come to their doors. But it did not matter. They had seen enough. Elias watched them carefully, not with judgment, but with the quiet understanding of a man who knew what it meant when truth arrived without needing proof. Sheriff Dalton Briggs stepped out of his office last, the paper still in his hand, though now it was blank again, the ink gone as if it had never existed. He looked at Elias, then at the others, his voice low but steady. Anyone else see something? No one answered. Not because they did not have answers, but because speaking them out loud would make them real in a way they could not take back. Carter shifted his weight, finally forcing a few words past his throat. It was just a feeling. He shook his head immediately after, like he did not believe himself. Mrs. Halford gripped her doorframe tighter. No, she said quietly. It was more than that. Her eyes moved across the street, meeting others who had stepped out, each face carrying the same expression, not fear of something coming, but fear of something already known. Elias took a slow breath, the cool air settling deep in his chest as he looked from one person to the next. You all heard it, he said, not a question. Dalton nodded once, reluctant but certain. And you all know why. That was the part no one wanted to admit. The wind picked up again, soft this time, moving through the town like it had been waiting for permission to return. A loose shutter tapped gently against a wall. Somewhere, a horse shifted in its stall, restless but quiet. Life was coming back, but not the way it had been before. Carter looked toward the edge of town, his voice barely above a whisper. She is gone. Elias followed his gaze, eyes narrowing slightly as he thought of the steady lantern light still burning beyond the last fence. No, Elias said after a moment. She left. The difference settled deeper this time. Dalton looked down at the blank paper in his hand, then folded it slowly, as if the words were still there even if they could not be seen. What happens now? He asked, though he already knew the answer would not be something he could write down or enforce. Elias adjusted his hat, his eyes steady, his voice calm. Now you remember, he said. No one argued. No one laughed it off. Because out here, when the night holds up a mirror and shows a man something he buried long ago, there is no running from it. The knocking had stopped, but its echo remained, not in the air, but in the minds of every person standing there. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the edges of Red Hollow, it became clear that nothing had been taken from them. Only something returned. Something they had hoped would stay gone. Morning did not bring relief. It only made everything clearer, and clarity was the one thing Red Hollow was not ready to face. The sun rose slow over the dry hills, casting long shadows that stretched across the town like fingers pointing at things better left unnamed, but now impossible to ignore. Doors stayed open longer than usual, not out of comfort, but because closing them felt like pretending again, and no one had the strength for that kind of lie anymore. Elias Crow stood near the hitching post where he had been the day before, his eyes moving across the town that looked the same but felt entirely different, like a place that had been quietly rearranged overnight without moving a single board. Carter Wells had not gone back inside. He stood on his porch, staring down at the wood beneath his boots, as if expecting something else to appear, something that would tell him what to do next. But nothing came. That was the hardest part. There was no instruction, no voice. Just memory, sitting heavy where it could not be set down. Mrs. Halford moved slowly across the street, her steps careful, not from weakness, but from the weight of something she carried inside now, something she had kept buried for years and could no longer pretend was gone. She stopped near the well, her hands clasped together, her eyes not meeting anyone else's. No one asked her what she saw. They already knew it would not be different from what they had seen themselves. Sheriff Dalton Briggs stepped out into the light, his badge catching the sun in a way that felt undeserved, like it belonged to a man who had done something worth standing tall for. He did not stand tall. He stood still, the folded paper still in his pocket, though he had checked it twice since dawn, each time hoping something would remain, something he could point to and call proof. But it was empty. That was the cruelest part of it. There was nothing to hold, nothing to show, nothing to deny. Elias watched him for a moment, then spoke, his voice calm, steady, cutting through the quiet without raising itself. You going to do something? Dalton looked at him, then away, his jaw tightening. About what? he asked, though the question carried no conviction. Elias did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let the town feel it, the same way the night had made them feel everything they had tried to forget. Finally, he said, about what you already know. That settled deeper than any accusation could have. Around them, others shifted, boots scraping lightly against dirt, hands adjusting hats that no longer felt like protection. Carter finally stepped off his porch, his movements slow, uncertain, like a man learning how to walk on ground that had changed beneath him. She is not coming back, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Elias nodded once. No, he said. She does not need to. Mrs. Halford closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with something new behind them. Not fear, not relief, but resolve. It was small, but it was there. Then we live with it, she said quietly. No one argued, because there was no other option left. Out here, there were no courts for this kind of thing, no law that could write it down and call it settled. There was only what a person chose to carry after the truth had been seen. Elias looked toward the edge of town, where the land stretched out wide and empty, where the lantern had burned through the night without flicker. It was gone now. No light, no sign, just open land again. But he knew better than to think it had disappeared. Some things did not leave. They stayed, not in the ground, not in the air, but in the space between a man and his own thoughts. And as the sun climbed higher over Red Hollow, it became clear that whatever Clara Whitlock had brought with her, she had not taken it away when she left. She had simply given it back. By late afternoon, the town had settled into something that looked like routine, but it moved wrong, like a clock that kept time without meaning it. Men returned to their work, but slower. Conversations started, then stopped before they reached anything real. Even the horses seemed quieter, as if they could feel the shift that had passed through Red Hollow and chosen not to leave. Elias Crow sat outside the general store, his chair tilted back against the wall, hat low, watching without staring. He had seen towns like this before, not broken, not ruined, just aware. And awareness had a way of changing things a man could not fix with his hands. Carter Wells crossed the street again, for the third time that hour, though he had nowhere to go. He paused near Elias, rubbing his jaw like he was trying to scrub something off that would not come loose. It should be over, Carter said, his voice rough from disuse. Elias did not look at him right away. It is, he said. Carter frowned slightly, shaking his head. Does not feel like it. Elias let the chair drop forward onto all four legs, boots settling into the dust. That is because it did not take anything from you, he said. It gave something back. Carter looked away at that, his eyes narrowing against the sun that now hung lower in the sky. He did not argue. He did not need to. Across the street, Mrs. Halford stood outside her home with a small wooden box in her hands, the kind used for keepsakes, for things meant to be forgotten slowly instead of all at once. She hesitated at the edge of her porch, then stepped down, moving with quiet determination toward the center of town. One by one, others noticed. A man from the blacksmith shop, a young woman from the boarding house, even Sheriff Dalton Briggs, who stepped out of his office again, drawn by something he could not name but no longer tried to ignore. Mrs. Halford stopped near the well, the same place she had stood that morning, and set the box down carefully on the wooden edge. She opened it slowly, the hinges creaking like they had not been used in years. No. One asked what was inside. They watched. That was enough. She reached in, her hand steady now, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn thin at the edges, its creases deep from being hidden too long. She did not read it out loud. She did not need to. She simply held it there for a moment, then placed it down beside the box, as if returning something that had never belonged to her alone. The gesture was small, but it moved through the town like a ripple in still water. Carter shifted beside Elias, his breath catching slightly as he watched. What is she doing? He asked. Elias's gaze stayed fixed on the well, on the paper now resting in the open light. She is choosing, he said. That was when Dalton stepped forward, slower than the rest, his hand resting briefly on the badge at his chest before falling away again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded blank paper he had carried since the night before. For a moment, he looked at it like he was hoping something would appear again, something to guide him, to excuse him. Nothing did. He walked to the well, stopping a few feet from Mrs. Halford, and placed his paper down beside hers. Still blank. Still heavy. Others began to move then, not all at once, not with certainty, but with something close enough. One man at a time, one small act at a time. No words, no speeches, just the quiet sound of things being set down where they could no longer be hidden. Elias remained where he was, watching as Red Hollow shifted again, not back to what it was, but forward into something it had avoided for a long time. He tipped his hat slightly, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself, then stood and turned toward the edge of town. The land beyond was empty again, just open sky and dry earth stretching out for miles. No lantern, no figure, no trace. But he did not need to see her to understand what she had done. Some people ride into a town and leave a mark you can point to. Others leave something quieter, something that stays long after they are gone. And as Elias Crow walked past the last fence post once more, he knew Red Hollow would remember this night for the rest of its days, not because of what happened, but because of what finally could not be denied. The sun dipped lower, and with it came a quiet that felt earned, not forced, the kind that settles only after something has been faced and left where it belongs. Red Hollow did not return to what it was, and no one expected it to. The well at the center of town now held more than water. It held a row of small things, papers, tokens, folded pieces of past choices placed side by side without explanation. No one guarded them. No one touched them. They remained in the open, where everyone could see and no one could deny. Carter Wells stood there longer than most, his hands finally still, his eyes no longer searching for something outside himself. He looked at the line of objects, then down at his own empty hands, and for the first time since the night before, he did not look away. Across the street, Mrs. Halford had returned to her porch, her shoulders lighter, not because anything had been erased, but because it had been acknowledged. That was enough. Sheriff Dalton Briggs stayed near the well as the lights softened into evening, his badge catching less of the sun now, reflecting instead the dim gold of a town learning to sit with its own truth. He did not issue orders. He did not speak much. He simply remained, as if standing there was the only honest thing left to do. Elias Crow reached the edge of town again, his boots crossing the same stretch of ground where the dust had once felt heavier. He paused at the last fence post, resting a hand on the worn wood, his gaze moving back across Red Hollow one more time. It was quieter now, but not hollow. There was something steadier in the way people moved, in the way doors stayed open just a little longer, in the way no one rushed to fill the silence with easy words. He looked out toward the open land beyond, the horizon stretching wide under a sky beginning to turn amber, and for a moment, he thought he saw it again, not a lantern, not a figure, just the faint sense of something that had passed through and left its mark without leaving a trace. He did not follow this time. There was nothing left to find out there. Whatever needed to be done had already been done. Behind him, a few more people approached the well, slower now, more certain, each carrying something small, something personal, something that no longer needed to stay hidden. They did not look at each other. They did not need to. The understanding had already settled in. Elias tipped his hat slightly, a quiet gesture to no one in particular, then turned and began walking away from Red Hollow, his steps steady, his path clear. The town would go on, as towns always do, but it would not forget. Not because someone told them to remember, but because forgetting was no longer possible. And somewhere beyond the reach of roads and fences, where the land held no names and no judgments, Clara Whitlock continued on her way, her suitcase no lighter, but no heavier either, carrying nothing that had not already found where it belonged. Out here, justice did not need a witness. It did not need a voice. It only needed a moment, and a town willing, or forced, to finally listen. The first night after felt different, not lighter, not easier, but honest in a way Red Hollow had not known for a long time. Lamps were lit again, but not all at once, and not to chase away fear, only to see things as they were. The well remained untouched, the row of small offerings still resting in plain sight, catching the last of the daylight before the sky turned dark again. No one covered them. No one moved them. It had become something else now, not a place of gathering, but a place of quiet truth that did not ask to be explained. Elias Crow had not gone far. He made camp just beyond the ridge where the town could still be seen if a man knew where to look, a low fire burning at his side, small and real, the kind that flickered and breathed the way fire should. He sat with his back against a rock, hat tipped forward, listening to the night settle in again, but this time it did not press down on the land. It rested. In the distance, a faint glow marked where Red Hollow lay, steady but no longer uneasy. He could not hear the town from where he was, but he did not need to. He knew the kind of quiet it carried now. Back in town, Sheriff Dalton Briggs stood alone at the well, long after the others had gone inside. He looked down at the papers, at the objects placed there without words, and for the first time, he did not wish they would disappear. He reached out, not to take anything, but to straighten one piece that had shifted slightly in the evening breeze. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but it carried more weight than any order he had given in years. Across the street, Carter Wells sat on the steps of his porch, not drinking, not speaking, just sitting with his thoughts in a way he had avoided for most of his life. He watched Dalton for a moment, then looked away, his gaze drifting toward the dark line at the edge of town where the land opened wide. He did not expect to see anything there, and he did not, but he no longer needed to. Mrs. Halford closed her door slowly that night, not out of fear, but out of rest, the kind that comes when a person no longer has to hold something in place that was never meant to stay hidden. The wind moved gently through Red Hollow, touching each building, each porch, each window, carrying nothing with it now, only passing through like it always had before things became complicated. Hours passed, and for the first time since the night before, people slept. Not deeply, not without dreams, but honestly. No knocks came. No unseen presence lingered at their doors. What had needed to arrive had already done so. Elias stared into his small fire, watching the flames bend and shift, the light moving the way it should, unpredictable but natural. He thought of Clara Whitlock, not as a mystery, not as something to be solved, but as a moment, a line drawn quietly in the dust that no one had noticed until they were forced to look. He did not know where she had gone. He did not need to. Some people do not stay in one place long enough to be understood. They pass through, and the understanding comes after they are gone. He leaned back slightly, eyes lifting toward the sky where the stars had come out, steady and distant, unchanged by anything that happened below them. And somewhere, beyond the reach of Red Hollow and the memory it now carried, Clara walked on under that same sky, her steps even, her path her own, leaving behind nothing but a town that had finally learned how to listen without being told what to hear. The morning after that first honest sleep came slowly, like the town itself was learning how to wake up again without carrying something hidden in its chest. Red Hollow did not rush. Doors opened one at a time. Boots stepped out onto porches with less hesitation, and the air felt clearer, not because anything had changed outside, but because something inside had finally settled. The well still held what had been placed there, but now it looked different, less like a burden and more like a marker, a line that had been crossed and would not be stepped back over. Elias Crow returned just after sunrise, his horse moving at an easy pace as he rode in from beyond the ridge, the dust rising gently behind him before settling back into place. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. A few people noticed, gave small nods, then went back to what they were doing, not out of indifference, but because there was no longer a need to watch everything so closely. Carter Wells was already at the well when Elias passed, standing there with his hat in his hands, not staring this time, just present. He glanced up briefly, meeting Elias's eyes, then gave a slight nod, the kind that did not ask for anything and did not offer excuses. Elias returned it and kept moving. Sheriff Dalton Briggs stepped out of his office a moment later, adjusting his coat, not his armor, but his habit, and walked toward the center of town with a steadiness that had not been there before. He paused at the well, looking down once more, then turned away without touching anything, as if he understood that some things were not meant to be fixed, only acknowledged. Mrs. Halford passed by with a small basket on her arm, heading toward the general store, her steps even, her gaze no longer avoiding others. She exchanged a quiet greeting with Carter, simple, ordinary, but it carried something new, a recognition that did not need explanation. The town moved. Like that now, small gestures, small changes, nothing loud, nothing forced, but each one real. Elias rode past the last row of buildings and slowed near the edge of town, his eyes drifting once more toward the open land beyond. The horizon stretched out the same as it always had, wide and empty, offering no answers, no signs, no trace of the woman who had passed through and changed everything without ever raising her voice. He sat there for a moment, the reins loose in his hand, the morning light warming the dust at his feet. A man could spend a lifetime chasing things he did not understand, trying to name them, explain them, make them fit into something smaller. Elias had learned long ago that some things were not meant for that. Some things were meant to be felt and then carried. He turned his horse back toward the road, not toward town, but away from it, his path stretching out into the same open land Clara Whitlock had walked into. He did not follow her trail. There was no trail left to follow. But he carried something now, not heavy, not light, just present, like a reminder that did not fade with distance. Behind him, Red Hollow continued on, not the same, but not broken either, a town that had been given something it did not ask for and had finally learned how to keep it without hiding from it. And as the sun climbed higher into the sky, casting its steady light across every rooftop and every face, it became clear that whatever had come through that place had not been there to stay, but it had left something behind that would. The road stretched long and quiet ahead of Elias Crow, the kind of road that did not promise anything except distance, and sometimes that was enough. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning chill, and the land opened wide on either side, empty in the way only the West could be, honest and unforgiving at the same time. He did not look back right away. A man who looks back too often never really leaves. But after a mile, maybe two, he slowed his horse and turned slightly in the saddle, just enough to see Red Hollow resting in the distance, smaller now, quieter, like it had settled into itself. It looked no different than it had days ago. Same rooftops, same dusty street, same well at the center. But Elias knew better. Some changes did not show themselves from far away. They lived in the way a place carried its silence, in the way people held their heads when no one was watching. He studied it for a moment longer, then nodded once, a gesture so small it would have meant nothing to anyone else. But to him, it marked the end of something that had begun before he even rode into that town. He turned forward again and continued on, the steady rhythm of hooves against dry earth the only sound that followed him now. Hours passed, the sun shifting, shadows stretching and bending across the land. Somewhere along that road, he came across a narrow stream, little more than a ribbon of water cutting through stone, and he stopped to let his horse drink. He dismounted slowly, boots pressing into the damp ground near the edge, and crouched down, letting his fingers dip into the cool water. It moved the way it should, constant, quiet, carrying whatever touched it further down without asking questions. He watched it for a while, his thoughts not racing, not searching, just settling into place like things finally finding where they belonged. A faint sound reached him then, not from behind, not from the road, but from somewhere off to the side, carried lightly on the breeze. He stood, turning his head just enough to listen. It was not a voice, not exactly, more like the echo of one, or maybe the memory of something spoken without needing to be heard. He did not follow it. He did not call out. He simply listened, then let it pass, the way a man does when he understands that some things are not meant to be held onto. He mounted again, adjusting the reins loosely in his hands, and continued on, his path cutting through the open land with no clear destination, only direction. Somewhere ahead, the road would meet another town, another set of faces, another place where people believed their stories were settled and their pasts were buried deep enough to stay that way. Elias did not hurry. He never did, because out here, the land had a way of bringing things to the surface when the time was right, and no sooner. Behind him, Red Hollow carried on, its people moving through their days with a quiet awareness that did not fade with the passing of time. They would work, speak, laugh even, but there would always be a moment, in the stillness between one breath and the next, where they remembered. Not because they were told to, not because they were forced, but because once something true is seen, it does not ask for permission to stay. And somewhere, beyond the reach of that memory, beyond the edge of that town and the road that led away from it, Clara Whitlock walked under the same sun, her steps steady, her path her own, carrying nothing that had not already been returned to where it belonged, leaving behind only what could never be taken away again. The next town did not know what was coming. And that was always how it began. A cluster of buildings sat low against the horizon, no larger than Red Hollow had been, its rooftops catching the late afternoon light in the same familiar way, its streets already holding the quiet assumptions of people who believed they understood each other. Elias Crow saw it from a distance and did not slow, his posture steady in the saddle, his eyes taking in the shape of the place without judgment. He had seen enough to know that towns did not need to look different to be different. It was always the same at first. A general store, a saloon, a few homes spaced just far enough apart to give the illusion of distance, but close enough for whispers to travel. As he rode closer, a few heads turned, not out of suspicion yet, just curiosity. A stranger always brought that. It was the beginning of every story out here. Elias dismounted near the hitching rail, tying his horse with a loose knot, the kind that could be undone quickly if needed. He stepped onto the wooden porch of the general store, boots creaking softly against the boards, and pushed the door open. The bell above it rang once, sharp and clear, cutting through the low murmur inside. A handful of people glanced his way, then returned to their conversations, though not fully. No one ever fully ignored a new face. The store smelled of dry goods and leather. Familiar, unchanged, the kind of place that carried routine in its bones. Elias moved to the counter, resting a hand on the worn surface, his gaze drifting briefly across the room. There it was again, that feeling. Not wrong. Not yet. Just waiting. Like something beneath the surface had not been stirred in a long time. The shopkeeper approached, a man in his late 50s, eyes sharp but tired, the kind of man who had seen enough to trust less than he once did. Passing through, he asked. Elias nodded once. For now. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. The shopkeeper studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod of his own, as if he understood something without needing it explained. Water's out back, he said. Horse will appreciate it. Elias tipped his hat slightly in thanks, then turned to leave. As he stepped back outside, the light had shifted, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the street. He paused on the porch, his eyes scanning the town again, slower this time, more deliberate. A woman stood across the way, near the edge of the road, a small bag at her feet, her posture still, her gaze not on the buildings, but on the people. No one stood beside her. No one spoke to her. The distance between her and the rest of the town was not measured in feet, but in something quieter, something more familiar than it should have been. Elias did not move for a moment. He had seen this before. Not the same face, not the same place, but the same line being drawn in the dust, invisible to those standing inside it, clear to anyone looking from the outside. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint sound of voices, low, uncertain, beginning to gather around something not yet spoken aloud. Elias stepped off the porch, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud, his gaze steady, his pace unhurried. He did not know what would happen here. He did not need to. Out here, stories did not repeat themselves exactly. They echoed. And sometimes, all it took was one quiet moment, one person standing alone, and a town ready to decide what kind of place it truly was. Elias Crow walked forward, not toward the woman, not toward the voices, but into the space between them, where things were still undecided, where silence had not yet chosen a side, knowing that whatever came next would not begin with noise, but with the same quiet weight that had once settled over Red Hollow, waiting to see who would listen this time. The space between them held longer than it should have, and that was where everything began to shift. The woman did not move, not when the voices grew a little louder, not when a few men stepped closer, their boots dragging slow lines through the dust, as if drawing a boundary that had not yet been agreed upon. She stood with her bag at her feet, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes steady, not defiant, not pleading, just present in a way that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. Elias Crow walked into that space without urgency, his steps measured, his posture loose, the way a man moves when he is not there to prove anything. The voices lowered as he passed, not because he asked them to, but because something in the way he carried himself made noise feel unnecessary. He stopped a few feet from the woman, not blocking her, not standing with her, just there, in the middle, where things were still undecided. A man near the front cleared his throat, adjusting his hat as if it gave him more authority than he actually had. We do not get many strangers staying long, he said, his tone even, but edged with something rehearsed. The kind of line that had been used before. The woman did not answer. She did not look at him. Her gaze remained forward, taking in the town as if she was memorizing it, not judging it. Elias glanced at her briefly, then back at the man. Seems like you get enough, he said quietly. It was not a challenge. It was an observation. That made it land harder. A few others shifted behind the man, their weight moving from one foot to the other, their certainty not as firm as it had been a moment ago. The wind moved lightly through the street, lifting a bit of dust, carrying it past them all without choosing a side. The man frowned slightly, not at Elias, but at the feeling that something was slipping out of his control. We like to know who is staying, he said, slower now. That all. The woman's fingers tightened slightly on the handle of her bag, the smallest movement, but Elias noticed it. Not fear, just a choice being considered. He spoke again, his voice steady, low enough that it did not carry far, but clear enough that it did not need to. Then ask, he said. Silence followed. Not long, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. The man hesitated, then looked at the woman directly for the first time. What is your name, he asked. It was simple. It should have been asked first. The woman turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Anna Hale, she said. Her voice was calm, even, carrying none of the tension that hung around her. The name did not change anything. Not yet, but it shifted the ground beneath their feet in a way none of them could ignore. She was no longer just a shape standing apart. She was someone. Elias watched the change ripple through the group, subtle but real. Questions replaced assumptions. Doubt replaced certainty. It was small, but small was where things always began. The man nodded once, slower this time, as if he was stepping onto unfamiliar ground. You passing through, he asked. Anna Hale shook her head slightly. Not today, she said. That answer lingered. Elias let out a quiet breath, almost a sigh, though it carried no frustration. Just recognition. He had seen this moment before. The point where a town decided whether it would repeat itself or not. He stepped back half a pace, not leaving, just giving the space back to them, where it belonged. The choice was never his to make. Around them, the tension did not disappear. It shifted. It softened in places, tightened in others, but it no longer pointed in one direction. And that was enough. Because out here, the difference between a town that listens and a town that decides too quickly is not loud. It is a pause. A question asked instead of assumed. A name spoken instead of ignored. And as the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the street, that pause held, fragile, uncertain, but real, waiting to see what kind of place this would become.